The air in the courtroom was thick, not just with silence, but with something heavier. Judgment, presumption, a sense of certainty that everyone knew exactly how this story would end. The young black man standing before the bench wore handcuffs and a simple dark hoodie that hung slightly off his shoulders. His name, according to the court docket, was Jalen Carter. But in the eyes of many seated around him, in their quick glances, their tight jaws, their furrowed brows, he wasn't a man with a name. He was a symbol. Another defendant. Another thug. Another one of them. The prosecutor's voice rang out with authority, cold and practiced, as he read the list of charges like a grocery list: resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, assaulting an officer. The words echoed off the wood-paneled walls and seemed to carry more weight than they should. Each syllable dripped with conviction, as if the facts were already ironclad, the verdict already delivered. Jalen didn't say a word. His gaze didn't flicker, didn't search for sympathy, didn't plead. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes forward, his posture calm, unnervingly calm. The handcuffs glinted under the courtroom lights, and yet somehow they looked out of place on him, as though they were meant for someone else entirely. On the other side of the room sat Sergeant Blake, the officer who had made the arrest. White, clean-shaven, confident in his seat. He leaned back with his arms folded and legs crossed, an arrogant smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't watching Jalen. He was studying him, savoring this moment, as if he were watching the final act of a play he'd directed himself. The judge had not yet entered the courtroom, a fact that seemed to stretch time like taffy. Every passing second felt longer than the last. The gallery, filled with spectators, reporters, and law clerks, murmured in hushed tones, casting glances not just at Jalen, but at each other, as though waiting for someone to say what they were all thinking: that this would be over quickly, that this was just another open and shut case, that a man like Jalen didn't need a trial. He needed a sentence. No one asked what really happened. No one questioned how a man with no prior convictions had suddenly found himself with 3 serious charges overnight. No one seemed to care that his public defender had met him only once. His hoodie, his skin, his silence, they spoke louder than any facts could. People didn't need details when they had assumptions. They didn't need truth when they had a story already written in their minds. Yet there was something in Jalen's silence that unsettled a few of them, something just beneath the surface, like the stillness of water hiding an undercurrent. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was patience, as if he knew something no one else did, as if this entire performance, every glare, every accusation, every smirk, was just the opening act. And still he didn't move. A bailiff coughed. The prosecutor checked his watch. The court clerk shuffled her papers. Sergeant Blake chuckled under his breath, but Jalen remained still, the storm inside him quiet and unshaken. The sound of the door opening at the back of the courtroom barely registered. All eyes remained fixed on the man in handcuffs, standing under the weight of decades of history, facing a system built to see him as guilty before he could speak a word. He didn't need to speak yet, because the truth, buried deep beneath layers of assumptions and uniforms and polished wood, was about to rise. And it wouldn't need permission. The afternoon sun poured through the cracked windshield, casting soft golden lines across Jalen Carter's face as he drove slowly down a quiet tree-lined avenue. He had no reason to rush. It was his day off, and all he had planned was an afternoon at the park with his niece, Maya. She sat in the back seat, kicking her feet in rhythm against the seat, humming a tune from a cartoon she'd watched a dozen times that week. Her braids bounced with every note, and her hands clutched a pink backpack filled with juice boxes, crayons, and a well-loved notebook covered in stickers. Jalen glanced at her through the rearview mirror and smiled. This, he thought, was peace. A simple moment of joy, uncomplicated, pure and beautiful. He turned onto a quiet stretch of road where the sunlight filtered through the oaks and made everything look like a photograph. The jazz station played softly in the background. He wasn't speeding. His seatbelt was fastened. The car was in perfect condition. There was no reason in the world for concern. But years of being a black man in America had taught Jalen something every black parent passes down to their child: Not every stop is about what you did. Sometimes it's just about who you are. The flash of red and blue lights in the mirror arrived like a punch to the stomach. His hands instinctively tightened on the wheel. The siren was short and sharp, as if the officer only needed to remind him once who held the power. Maya's song stopped mid-verse. "Uncle Jay?" she asked, her voice quiet and unsure. Jalen forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, baby," he said gently. "Just a quick stop." But in his chest, the calm cracked. He signaled, pulled over, and turned off the ignition. His fingers moved with practiced care. Slowly, deliberately, he rolled down the window halfway and placed his hands visibly on the steering wheel. The air around him felt heavier now, tighter. He exhaled once, quietly, and waited. The officer approached, white tall, sunglasses reflecting the sun like a mirror shielding his eyes. His badge read Sergeant Blake. Jalen noticed the way his hand rested, not casually, but instinctively, on the grip of his weapon. "License and registration," Blake barked. No greeting, no explanation, just the voice of someone who believed he was in complete control. Jalen nodded, narrating each movement as he reached toward the glove compartment. "I'm getting my registration now. Wallet's in my back pocket." Blake said nothing, but watched with the kind of stare that didn't search for understanding, only for justification. Maya peeked forward from the back seat. "Hi, Mr. Police," she said softly, trying to smile. Blake didn't even glance at her. After handing over the documents, Jalen looked up. "May I ask what I was stopped for, officer?" Blake's lips twitched. "Step out of the vehicle," he said instead. Jalen blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. What's the reason?" The officer's posture changed. His hand rested heavier on his hip. "You resisting now?" The words were laced with threat, not inquiry. Jalen paused, then unbuckled slowly, stepping out onto the warm pavement, his heart racing even though his voice stayed calm. "My niece is in the car," he said evenly. "Please don't scare her." Blake didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed Jalen's arm and spun him roughly around. The movement was sudden, violent. Jalen's chest hit the hood of the car. Maya screamed from inside. "Uncle Jay!" Her tiny hands pressed against the back window as she cried. Jalen's face pressed into the metal, the sun-warmed surface now cold as betrayal. His wrists were yanked back and locked into steel. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved aggressively, but the cuffs clicked around his wrists like they were always meant to be there. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting," Blake said, smugness dripping from his voice like oil. "You can fight it later in court." Jalen turned his head slightly, the metal biting into his cheek. "I want your badge number," he said through clenched teeth. That's when Blake leaned in. "Close. Too close. You think anyone's gonna believe you?" he whispered. "A hoodie, tattoos. Your kind always act innocent, until the report comes out." And just like that, he made it clear this wasn't about justice. It was about power. Another officer arrived, a woman this time, who gently pulled Maya out of the car as she wailed, her tiny arms reaching toward her uncle. "Don't take him. He didn't do anything. He was taking me to the park." The second officer whispered something soothing, but Maya resisted, crying out his name as they guided her away. Jalen's body was still, but his heart cracked open in that moment. Not from fear, not from pain, but from knowing a piece of Maya's innocence had just been stolen. He had always known this country was built on assumptions, but now Maya had seen it too, with her own eyes. And that, to Jalen, was the real crime. As he sat in the back of the squad car, the door slammed shut beside him. No one read him his rights. No one asked for his side of the story. They didn't need to. The cuffs, the hoodie, color of his skin, that was all the jury Blake needed. But Jalen wasn't thinking about Blake anymore. He was thinking about Maya's voice, high-pitched and trembling, shouting through the chaos. He was thinking about how many black men had sat in that same back seat, taken down not by justice, but by presumption. He wasn't angry. He was focused. Because even in chains, even with his dignity crushed under a boot, Jalen Carter knew something the officers didn't. They thought they had silenced him. But all they had done was give him a story the world needed to hear, and the platform to expose every last lie they'd buried behind a badge. The courtroom walls seemed to close in with the weight of expectation, the kind that clings to the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Time ticked forward, but everything felt suspended, as though the very room was holding its breath. Jalen Carter stood motionless at the defendant's table, the steel cuffs around his wrists biting gently into his skin, but his face betrayed no pain, no panic. His breathing was slow and steady, his expression unreadable, almost serene. His shoulders, despite the day he had just lived through, remained squared. There was a quiet power about him, the kind that made people either uneasy or intrigued, depending on how willing they were to see beyond the surface. The judge had not yet entered the chamber, which only added to the rising tension that curled through the room like smoke. People were whispering behind hands, sneaking glances at Jalen, eyes darting back and forth between him and the tall, white man seated confidently across the aisle. Sergeant Blake leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, hands folded casually over his chest. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a shine, and his face carried the unmistakable smirk of a man who believed he had already won. To the average onlooker, it was a clear-cut scene. A black man in handcuffs standing trial for disrespecting the law, and a white officer, clean and authoritative, ready to be applauded for his service. They had heard the charges: resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, assaulting an officer. The narrative had already taken shape in their minds. Jalen Carter was guilty, because why else would he be here? Who was he to question a police officer? Who was he to resist? The weight of those assumptions didn't crush Jalen, it steadied him, because he'd lived long enough to understand that in rooms like this, silence often speaks louder than words, and patience can be more explosive than anger. What they mistook for passivity was calculation. He had learned long ago that power reveals itself most clearly not in rage but in control. And he was in complete control, even now. The prosecutor, a balding man in a slick gray suit, stood near the bench, shuffling papers more for show than necessity. He kept glancing at the clock, then at the double doors, waiting for the judge to enter, so they could move forward and dispose of this case quickly. Open and shut. 10 minutes max. He'd seen 100 of these before. So had the clerk, the bailiff, the rows of reporters scribbling in their notebooks as they pre-wrote their headlines. The only one not rushing this moment was Jalen. Even the bailiff, standing rigid beside the door, kept glancing toward the entrance, subtly shifting his weight from foot to foot. Something was off. The judge was never late. Sergeant Blake chuckled under his breath, as if the delay were a personal comedy for his own entertainment. He whispered something to his colleagues sitting beside him, and they shared a laugh, low and mean. Jalen heard it, but didn't react. His eyes were fixed forward, locked on the empty bench, and for a brief second, a smile almost touched the corner of his mouth. He thought about Maya, about her tears, her tiny voice shouting his name. He thought about the way the cuffs had clicked into place without hesitation, about the officer's words, "No one's going to believe you." That moment was no longer just a memory. It was evidence. And soon, everyone in this room would witness exactly how wrong Blake had been. The murmurs in the courtroom began to swell as the minutes dragged on. Reporters whispered theories. A woman in the second row whispered, "Maybe the judge is sick." A man beside her muttered, "Probably just running late. Happens all the time." But something in the way the bailiff stood now, stiff, almost nervous, said otherwise. Jalen caught it. So did the clerk. There was a beat of unease building beneath the surface. Blake didn't notice. He was too busy imagining the headline, "Officer vindicated after violent arrest." He leaned back further, confident, untouchable. Jalen, in contrast, stood like a statue chiseled out of granite, still, silent, steady. No words, no shift in stance, just waiting. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The moment when the truth would walk through those doors and unravel every lie that had been sewn into the seams of the report. He had watched systems protect officers like Blake before, watched video evidence dismissed, watched victims demonized. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about what his presence in this courtroom represented. A challenge, a threat, a disruption to the carefully curated illusion that the system was always right, always fair, always blind. But today the system would blink. The murmuring grew louder. A couple of people stood to peek over the gallery. The prosecutor was now visibly frustrated, tapping his fingers against the podium. The clerk stepped toward the bench, then hesitated. She looked at the bailiff, who only gave a slight shake of the head. Wait, just wait. And then, finally, the courtroom doors opened, not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate push. The sound of leather shoes echoed across the polished marble floor. Everyone turned. The air changed, not just in volume, but in tone. Something was coming. Jalen didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew. The doors creaked open with a slow deliberateness that seemed to part the air itself, and every head in the courtroom turned as a tall, regal figure stepped inside. He moved like he had walked that path 1,000 times before, measured, unhurried, yet impossible to ignore. He wore the long black robes of authority, but even without them, the energy he carried announced his presence. He was a black man in his 60s, gray at the temples, deep lines on his face that spoke of battles fought not just in courtrooms, but in life. His name was Judge Raymond Thompson, a man who had sat on federal benches, lectured at law schools, and ruled in cases that had made headlines across the country. His name carried weight, but few in this courtroom recognized him. Most assumed he was here to substitute, perhaps covering for an ill local judge. But what they didn't know was that this moment, every second of it, had been designed, orchestrated, and it was about to upend everything they thought they understood. The bailiff straightened immediately, offering a tight nod as Judge Thompson passed. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat, shuffling papers he no longer cared about. Sergeant Blake, too relaxed in his seat just moments ago, now sat upright. His smirk faded, replaced by confusion. Jalen remained still. He didn't even turn around. He didn't need to. The energy told him all he needed to know. The trap was springing shut, not around him, but around the lie they had tried to bury him in. Judge Thompson did not walk to the bench. He walked directly toward Jalen Carter. At first, people assumed he had mistaken his path. The clerk even called out gently, "Your Honor, the bench is this way." But the judge didn't respond. He didn't slow down. His eyes were fixed on Jalen, and the two men looked at each other, not as strangers, but as comrades, as equals, as men who understood what it meant to be underestimated, profiled, doubted. Thompson stopped just inches from Jalen, who stood motionless, his cuffs still binding his wrists, but his posture unchanged, calm, proud, unbending. And then it happened, with the whole courtroom watching in stunned silence. Judge Thompson removed the robe from his shoulders. Gasps filled the air instantly, like a wave crashing into the shore. Reporters leaned forward, pens dropping. The prosecutor froze mid-breath. Blake's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. The robe, the very symbol of legal authority, hung loose in Thompson's hand for a moment. Then, slowly, reverently, he placed it over Jalen's shoulders. Silence. It lasted long enough to feel suffocating. You could hear someone whisper a prayer. You could hear a reporter drop their phone. And still, Jalen did not speak. He adjusted the robe slightly, then looked down at the cuffs around his wrists. Judge Thompson finally turned to the courtroom, his voice calm but thunderous in its weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "allow me to introduce you to someone this courtroom has already judged before hearing his truth. This man standing before you is not a criminal. He is not a suspect. He is a federal judge. And today, he stood here in chains to expose what so many choose not to see." The room erupted. Some gasped. Others whispered accusations. A few stood up instinctively. Blake's face drained of color as he slowly stood, eyes darting around the room like a man trapped. He looked at Jalen, truly looked at him, for the first time. Gone was the image of a thug, of a stereotype. In front of him stood a man with power far greater than he had ever imagined. A man who had chosen silence as a scalpel, not a surrender. Jalen finally raised his hand slightly, and Judge Thompson stepped forward to remove the cuffs. They fell to the floor with a metallic clink, a sound that rang like a final verdict. Jalen rolled his shoulders once, then turned toward the gallery, his voice steady, calm, precise. "I told him someone would believe me," he said, his eyes locking onto Blake's. "I just didn't tell him it would be the entire nation." Blake stumbled forward, stammering. This is some kind of setup. This is entrapment." Jalen cut him off with a calmness that felt like judgment itself. "No, this is exposure. You didn't just arrest a man. You assaulted a judge while your body cam was rolling. You filed a false report. You traumatized a child. And you did it all because of how I looked, not who I was. But today that mask comes off." The prosecutors were already scrambling. Phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. The reporters began typing, recording, calling. The judge's robe, now resting firmly on Jalen's shoulders, transformed the courtroom into something more than a legal space. It became a reckoning. Jalen walked slowly toward the bench. No longer a defendant, no longer on trial. He ascended the steps with quiet authority, the robe flowing behind him like a flag. He sat, centered, steady, and as the room hushed once more, he looked out across the faces that had once judged him. Then he said, "Let the record show. Truth has entered the courtroom." The silence that settled over the courtroom now was different from the silence earlier. Before, it had been laced with judgment, with expectation, with the quiet, invisible hum of racism that filled spaces like this without being spoken aloud. But now, it was a silence of reckoning, of realization, of watching a lie collapse in real time and witnessing the man you thought you had condemned sit, robed in authority, at the very bench from which you expected to see him fall. Judge Jalen Carter sat straight-backed, eyes forward, the same calmness in his face, but now it radiated power instead of restraint. The courtroom lights cast a golden sheen across his shoulders, and the robe, once symbolic of a system that had humiliated him, now clung to him like armor. He didn't need to speak to command the room. His very presence redefined the roles everyone thought they understood. The gallery no longer saw a man who had been profiled. They saw a man who had been patient, and that patience had turned into justice with a thunderclap. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I spent hours in that holding cell," he began, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "and not once did I feel powerless. Not because I believed the system would protect me, but because I knew I had something far more dangerous than rage. I had the truth, and I had the patience to let you expose yourselves." He turned his gaze towards Sergeant Blake, who now stood stiff, red-faced. His arrogance melted away. Gone was the swagger, the smirk, the lean-back confidence. In its place stood a man stripped bare by his own assumptions, by his own cruelty, by his own words. Blake opened his mouth to speak, but Jalen cut the air with a glance. "You were right about one thing, Officer Blake," he continued. "No one was going to believe me. If I were just a name on a police report. If I were just another black man with a claim and no evidence. But you gave me more than a report. You gave me footage, witnesses, and arrogance." He turned his attention to the clerk, the prosecutor, the observers, and the press, now furiously taking notes. "I didn't come here just to clear my name. I came here because this courtroom has processed 100 men who looked like me with less attention, less doubt, and less humanity than you gave a barking dog. I came here because somewhere in this country, a child is learning the same fear I had to unlearn just to become a judge. And that child deserves a world where silence doesn't mean surrender and respect isn't mistaken for weakness." He paused. The quiet in the room deepened, reverent now. Everyone could feel that something was shifting, not just in the case, but in themselves. "I let myself be arrested. I didn't resist. I followed every order. I let you put your hands on me. Why? Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. And now that I know, I'll make sure the world knows too. This isn't just your disgrace, Officer Blake. It's your department's, your systems, your legacy." A ripple moved through the press gallery. Phones buzzed. Keyboards clattered. But no one dared to interrupt him. Blake looked to the prosecutor, eyes wide, silently begging for help. But the prosecutor had already stepped away. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he thumbed through papers he no longer wanted to read. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. You called me a thug. You looked at my skin, my clothes, my silence, and you decided I wasn't worth the courtesy of a question. That's not just bias. That's policy disguised as instinct. And you've operated under it so long. You thought it was truth. He stood then, slowly, deliberately, and every eye followed him as he stepped from the bench. This robe doesn't give me dignity, he said. I brought my dignity into this courtroom long before you ever saw it. This robe doesn't make me worthy. I was worthy even when I stood before you in handcuffs. And if you couldn't see that, then the cuffs were never on me. They were on you. He stepped toward Blake now, each step a nail in the coffin of ignorance. You thought power was in the badge, in the cuffs, in the threat. But real power is knowing who you are when no one claps for you. When everyone doubts you, when you're asked to stay silent and you choose instead to wait for the right moment to speak. A young reporter in the back whispered, This is history. And she was right, because what had unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just a reversal, it was a revelation. A system that had always bet on silence had been confronted with a man who chose to wait, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted the whole world to see what justice actually looked like when it walked in the door unannounced. Judge Carter turned back to the bench one last time. He placed the robe gently over his arm and laid it on the railing. Justice, he said, looking out at the courtroom one final time, isn't about what happens after a gavel falls. It's about who gets to hold it. And with that, he walked out, not just a free man, but a man who had redefined what freedom looked like. Thank you for watching Black Echoes Global. If this story shook you, if it made you angry, made you proud, or made you think, share it. Because the more we speak these truths, the harder they are to silence. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were Jalen? Until next time, stay strong, stay loud, stay free.